So good afternoon. My name is Peter Casarella. I'm the Executive Director of Funds Vitae, which is the Catholic initiative that we started 2 years ago in the Duke Divinity School for the entire university to foster traditions of learning across the disciplines at Duke University. And I founded it with Reinhard Hütter, and with the able assistance of Troy Cassian, we've moved forward. I want to thank the co-sponsors for the event this afternoon, starting with Professor David Ayres and Michael Cornett from the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I'd also like to thank Drs. Polly Ha and Alfredo Watkins of the second year Transformative Ideas program, who together with Bobby Douglas really gave us a lot of support and encouragement for this event today. And I especially want to thank the 17 students from Dr. Ha's Free to Think class that are joining us here today. Our speaker is a very good friend and colleague of many, many years. He has been, since 2015, an associate professor of religion philosophy at the University of Southern California and is the founder of the Nova Forum, a Catholic initiative at the University of Southern California. His dissertation from the University of Chicago was awarded the Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theological Excellence and was published by Oxford University Press as Mathematical Theologies, Nicholas of Cusa and the Legacy of Thierry of Chartres. This year, he published again with Oxford, I even have show and tell, The Geometry of Christian Contemplation, Measure Without Measure, a study which offers a revisionist reading of Plotinus and a rehabilitation of much needed figures to study, such as Theodore the Studite and Ochard of St. Victor. In 2024, he also edited this one, I really want to show you, with this Andrew Warhol style cover. Cusanus Today, Thinking with Nicholas of Cusa, Between Philosophy and Theology. In all of these works, David Albertson has given us food for thought, much needed reflection on the interstices between the disciplines, on wisdom that exceeds science, and on many different contemplative and practical traditions that come together in unique configurations in ways that I think are very important at a time when silos and fragmentation dominate the university. Next summer, Yale Press will publish a book that he co-authored with political scientists from Pepperdine, Jason Blakely, Utopia for Our Century, a Manifesto of Hope, a rewriting of Moore's classic work for our times. This timely work also emphasizes that hope in times of crisis requires the engagement of the imagination. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Albertson, who will speak this afternoon on free-thinking medieval women, Hadewijch of Beguine, and Philosopher.
Thank you for the invitation here. Thank you, Peter, very much, and Professor Ha, for everyone who made this possible. I was, thinking that I would have to leave behind the sunshine in California, but it's the most ideal, platonic ideal fall day. So thank you for that, for whoever arranged that for all of us. Free-thinking medieval women, Hadewijch, the Beguine, and Philosopher. What does it mean to think freely? What are the different conditions of free inquiry, whether in antiquity, the Middle Ages, or our own beleaguered present? What are some signal instances of intellectual liberty in pre-modern Christian traditions? And what experiences of Christian faith either stimulated such independent thinking or resulted from it? I'd like to use our time today to share with you a little-known Christian author who deserves a closer look, a free-thinking medieval lay woman, who I have come to think is not only a teacher, a poet, a mystic, she was all of those as well, but also a kind of avant-garde philosopher. Her name is Hadewijch of Brabant. We used to say Hadewijch of Antwerp, but now we're not so sure exactly about the city, so we'll just say the region, around it. Hadewijch was a little-known lay woman who lived in the middle of the 13th century around 1250. That's about as much as we know. And here's an image often used in her stead, which is of course not of her, but maybe of a contemporary who dressed similarly. I suppose that's all we've got. Although we cannot know for sure, she was probably affiliated with the Beguine community, more on that in a moment, in the vicinity of Antwerp in the present-day Belgium. Beguine communities were autonomous female collectives organized by and for lay women in the 13th to 15th centuries in Northern Europe. Economically independent, they provided spiritual formation, literary education, and medical care for women of all ages. They did not take religious vows like women in the cloister, but they also postponed or declined marriage and children. Beguine houses became cities within the city, centers of women's education and literary production outside both monastery and university. For over a century, they remained free from episcopal control until a crackdown of a kind began at the Council of Vienne in the 1310s, although they still flourished for several centuries. And I'll show you some photos of the architecture that remains. Maybe some of you, if you've been lucky, have been to Belgium and visited some of the beautiful beguinage that you can tour still. Many of the women we consider mystics in medieval Europe, like Mechthild of Magdeburg, Marguerite Porete, and others, flourished in these Beguine communities, and it's thanks to them that we get a great upsurge in Northern Europe in the 13th century of women writing about their Christian experience in the vernacular texts that we still have. A little bit of images here to begin. So here's a painting of a Beguine community that gives a sense of their life. They adopted a simple form of dress, which was not a required habit, at least in the first centuries. They're spotted all over Belgium and the Netherlands today, in houses of various size. In more, I highly recommend Cities of Ladies, Beguine communities in the medieval Low Countries by Walter Simons, and the Beguines of medieval Paris by Tanya Stabler-Miller. We only know about Hadewijch because she left behind a truly remarkable and multi-genre dossier of writings in Middle Dutch. And so you can look at her translations if you're interested, especially for students, in the wonderful Classics of Western Spirituality series. You have in this volume, we didn't know about Hadewijch till the 1940s, and now we have a one-volume, relatively inexpensive translation of all of her works across 4 genres in one book. So it's quite a deal, really. And then these are the kind of communities. These are all much later, 16th, 17th century architectural rehabs that you can still visit. And today, they belong to the state, these Beguine communities in Belgium. And to my understanding, they're rented out exclusively to either young women who are artists and teachers or older women who are retired. So they try to preserve the same sort of function. They're a little bit different in each different city that you Hadewijch's works survive in 3 manuscripts and were known to late medieval masters like the Augustinian canon Jan van Ruysbroek. Today we have 31 didactic letters that have an internal rhyme scheme in many of them, some of them as long as short treatises, 45 stanzaic poems, likely songs set to meter, 16 long philosophical couplet poems, and 14 wild, colorful, cinematic, sometimes erotic visions. You can find her complete works in the volume that I shared there. Her writings belong to this early wave of vernacular literature by European women, and the first significant generation of women writers in the history of Christian literature, after a few others like Hildegard of Bingen, but not many. Hadewijch's autobiographical letters convey a strong conviction of her own teaching authority over other women, suggesting that she once held some position of leadership in her local community. She writes in one letter, quote, "I admonish you as a sister, I demand of you as a mother her child, and I order you from your beloved as a groom orders his bride." So Hadewijch has, as part of the delight of reading her, just a very strong sense of self and a very sort of high esteem of herself as a teacher. And she says exactly what she thinks in these letters. But these same letters, and here's an image to rest with for a moment. The same letters also obliquely recount a traumatic event that she underwent, her forced expulsion from that very community after unnamed individuals came to oppose her radical ideas. Members of her community began to take measures that Hadewijch says she fears will lead to her separation from the community in one letter, quote, "Those with whom we have chosen to jubilate in our beloved are out seeking to undermine us here and break our companionship," she's writing to another woman. In particular, she says, they focus their actions on isolating her. Quote, "They do not want me to be with anyone," she laments. Hadewijch writes to a former disciple in a different community, warning her, quote, "They would like to pull you away from us. To them, they break their hearts over our exceptional faithfulness." So more of her personality coming through. Thereafter, it appears she lived alone. She talks about wandering. She's writing and thinking, exiled from her home community, and her works seem to date after this experience, in reflection upon it, and as the reason for her epistolary production. Since Hadewijch was rediscovered in the 1940s by the Flemish Jesuit Joseph van Mierlo, generations of Belgian and Dutch scholars have scrutinized her texts and sought to describe her iconoclastic voice. Well-known American scholars like Bernard McGinn, Amy Hollywood, Patricia Daly have approached Hadewijch first and foremost as a female mystic, locating her within that familiar, if constructed, category. But I'd like to suggest a slightly different approach and propose that we interpret Hadewijch not only as a mystic, but also, and perhaps in the first place, as a philosopher, an avant-garde philosopher of a kind, radical before her time, precisely in her distance from monastic and scholastic communities, which populate many of our narratives about medieval philosophy. Hadewijch offers novel accounts of subjectivity, of reason, and of desire. After her peers forcibly expelled her, she turned her mind to this trauma, and she converted her experience of being exiled into a central category in her writings. Theorizing her location as a permanent outsider, Hadewijch construes exile as the proper condition for thinking and experiencing God and herself. All of us, she says, not only her, live in the exile that is immanence or finitude, the condition of being human. She says she freely sacrifices her immediate enjoyment of God that she had in that home community and willingly confines herself to a desert of pure longing where she desires God even more than before. To get a flavor of her thinking, let's look at 3 examples from her poems. First one, "Love makes me wander outside myself. Where shall I find something of love, according to my heart's delight, so that I may sweeten my pain? Although I follow her, she flies. Although I attend her school, she will not agree with me in anything." So capital L, love. The Middle Dutch is minne, minnemystiek, love mysticism. But Hadewijch treats this as a sort of name of God, a face of God. She also uses God and love sometimes together. It's a bit of a riddle of how those things piece together. But the main protagonist, especially when she's experiencing suffering, is love. Another example. "Never was so cruel a desert created as love can make in her land. For she impels us to long desiringly for her and to taste her without knowing her being. She shows herself as she takes flight. We pursue her, but she remains unseen. This makes the miserable heart ever exert itself." So it's like the greater the distance, the greater the desire. Last example. And here, if you know a little bit about negative theology and Pseudo-Dionysius or Meister Eckhart, a sort of unnaming of God or an unseeing of God, you can hear glimmers of that same idea here in her poetry, but it's not a sort of naming cognitive enterprise of the mind. This is an affective negation. "To be reduced to nothingness in love is the most desirable thing I know among all the works I have experience of, although I know it is beyond my reach. And if anyone then dares to fight love with longing, without heart and without mind, and love counters this longing with her own longing, that is the force by which we conquer love." So she has this sense of antagonism and struggle between her and love, often depicting herself as the sort of knight who's wooing the difficult lady, this late medieval trope. Medieval women mystics are often contemplatives and visionaries. Sometimes they're poets, in some cases other disciplines altogether, like the music and natural science of Hildegard of Bingen. But are any of them also medieval philosophers? And what would that mean for our concepts of philosophy? Was Hadewijch, indisputably a great mystical poet, the first great Dutch poet, also a philosopher, or could she be one? What would that mean for us today? Is it, as one colleague suggested to me very kindly, a well-intentioned but perhaps misguided attempt to endow her with a masculine authority she neither has nor needs? Or is it rather a matter of equity, a sort of seizure of intellectual authority on her behalf to ensure that she's accorded the status that the quality of her thought deserves? Could it be a tactic to marshal attention and to attempt more medievalists to spend time in the company of a great mind, like Peter Abelard or Meister Eckhart? What does it mean to be a poet who's also a philosopher, like Dante or Alan of Lille or Lucretius or Nietzsche, for that matter? Or as another friend advised when I was suggesting this, should we instead call her a great theologian, but maybe not a great philosopher, in the way that Bonaventure or Julian of Norwich are theologians first and last? On the other hand, I replied, can we hold the line between philosophy and theology so confidently in the 13th century, and what is more, outside the universities, where we have other means to make that distinction? So the question, is Hadewijch a radical medieval philosopher, quickly unfolds into another: what is a medieval philosopher? One mistake, perhaps, that we can avoid at the outset is to equate medieval Christian philosophy with the Aristotelian tradition. And an article I commend to you, it's in German, but it's been important for me, from 1999, Metaphysikas Lebensform. Theo Kobisch, the German philosopher, makes the argument that there's not one but three distinct metaphysical projects that endure from classical antiquity through the Middle Ages, each with its own founding texts, internal logic, and rightful claim to philosophical legitimacy. So briefly on this point, Aristotelian ontology, he says, begins with commentaries on the metaphysics back to the 3rd century. This tradition, from Aquinas up to Suarez, he says, among others, constructs a universal ontology. Some historians of philosophy have insisted that medieval philosophy is identical with this tradition, a first beginning in metaphysics with Aristotle, and then the famous thesis of Ludger Honefelder, a zweite Anfang der Metaphysik, a second beginning of metaphysics in the 13th and 14th century. I think this was a more popular view maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but it's probably not a majority view. Second tradition, Platonic henology, pursues the radical interpretations of Plato's Parmenides by authors like Plotinus or Proclus or Pseudo-Dionysius. Here, unity is above being, a metaphysics of the one that also becomes a metaphysics of the knowing subject in Meister Eckhart, or even, Kobisch suggests, in German idealism. Eckhart, of course we can say, Bert Flasch, is a theologian, a mystic, and a philosopher. And apparently there's no problems at all with that, with Meister Eckhart, as and certainly for Nicholas of Cusa as well, if we look at that book. A third tradition, Kobisch identifies, however, he calls Christian mystagogy, a third philosophical stream that starts now not from the Parmenides, not from the metaphysics, but from the Song of Songs, and its tradition of theological and philosophical commentaries from Origen of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, and many others. In this tradition, an affective metaphysics prioritizes the transformation of the self's desires, philosophy as a way of life, and rejects a sharp division between theology and philosophy, and experiments often with literary forms. Bernard of Clairvaux and Richard of St. Victor, according to Kobisch, belong to this type and are philosophers. We can see this other new work by Christian Trottmann on Bernard of Clairvaux and the philosophy of the Cistercians, 2021. Hadewijch certainly belongs to this latter tradition, Christian mystagogy. Mystagogies of Eros, like Gregory of Nyssa. On the other hand, her unsettling use of apophatic negation make contributions to henological traditions as well, as we just saw in that poem. Hadewijch, in a way, fuses both tendencies, both negation of the second type and desire from the third type, in ways that at times anticipate, I think, even modern philosophies of religion in a kind of post-Kantian figure that I want to discuss in what follows. Rather than maintain Hadewijch's exile and her exile from medieval philosophy, we can listen to her uncanny voice and hear how it troubles the continuum that organizes many of our conventional historiographies. One way we might discuss her as a philosopher has been taken up by Christina van Dijk in this short book, A Hidden Wisdom, Medieval Contemplatives on these topics. And Van Dijk's strategy here is to find the topics that are most in use in medieval philosophy, let's say in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, and then locate where do medieval women also discuss these things. The immortality of the soul, for example. The limits of reason, the nature of personhood and agency, questions about the afterlife. The strength of this is that it sets aside some of the peculiar conditions attending women's authorship. The downside is it sets aside some of the peculiar conditions attending women's authorship and maybe misses some of the distinctives that they offer in a different kind of philosophy. So I'd like to explore a different method for naming Hadewijch as a medieval philosopher, a way of immanence. If theology begins with supernatural grace, philosophy oversees a domain of natural reason. To philosophize is to confine one's concepts, warrants, procedures, sources to what can be immanently known in the world without invoking divine transcendence beyond the world. The advantage of this method is its longevity. It may have begun, we could date it, in concepts of natura naturans among 12th century Christian Platonists, especially in the school of Chartres. But it's classically grounded in the Parisian controversies of 1277 and the arts faculty over the authority of Aristotle and the way the rediscovery of Aristotle set up two domains for sort of secular philosophy and then theological philosophy. But in this view, there is a domain of reason which God has handed over to the autonomy of the human mind, its own native terrain, where reason can make discoveries freely distinct from the truths of revelation. Hadewijch, however, is an interesting case because she asserts, as we'll see, a strict understanding of immanence, of operating out of finitude, on Christological grounds in the imitation of Jesus. Because in her mystical visions, Jesus precisely commands Hadewijch to forego any easy appeal to divine transcendence and to conform radically to his own kenotic suffering and abandonment by remaining in finitude. And that means thinking from that perspective. If it's immanence that makes one a philosopher, Hadewijch is a philosopher because she is a mystic, paradoxically. Hadewijch's provocative teachings are centered around this concept of loving God from exile. The true lover, she says, is and remains in exile, far away, alone, isolated. And she proves her love of God by remaining resolutely in that eccentric location and by deliberately renouncing attempts to evade it or escape it, with sort of echoes of Socrates refusing escape from prison, in my mind at least, including any sort of subtle attempt, she says, to quietly compensate oneself psychically for the sufferings of that exile through acts of self-consolation. So she has a critique of superficial religions that she explains. Her very distance from God incites her desire for God all the more. But to what is she exiled exactly in this experience of desire? For Hadewijch, the true lover is exiled to immanence and renounces easy access to transcendence. They've given up claims to escape the condition of finitude by pretending to some sort of final supernatural closure. She calls this posture, this position, not faith, but a fidelity, which is, her term, an unfaith. Not a quick victory by escaping the conditions of human being into a supernatural kind of existence on earth, but instead she calls it a non-victory, a renunciation. For Hadewijch, the fundamental Christian task is to remain in finitude with Jesus. But this is also the task of philosophy, to grapple with human experience, with the world, even with matters of faith, from wholly within the bounds of reason alone. In what remains, I'd like to look at two sides of this kind of philosophical thinking. One, more on her mystical experience of remaining in immanence, and then the second, surprisingly, all the things she has to say about reason, because this is not a sort of irrational, affective mysticism in the body, which is sometimes a stereotype of mysticism, but in fact, she's talking about reason and its importance all the time. So on that first topic, back to our alleyway here. Hadewijch experienced a concrete, real, material exile of a kind, as we said. But as she comes to reckon with its meaning, she evolves a concept of spiritual exile. This theme extends from her letters to her songs, the stanzaic poems. Her teaching clearly precipitated the exile. It may have been this very teaching that made her colleagues, show her the door because it was too much for them. But surely that experience of exile must have confirmed and even kind of been a conspicuous metaphor of her understanding of God before. Hadewijch understands exile as a matter of voluntary obedience and not exclusively an involuntary violence that she suffered. She's learned to take this traumatic separation on board as a task. Quote, "Though you feel miserable of heart, as if you were abandoned by God," she writes to another woman, "do not be saddened by this, for love rewards fully, though she often arrives late." This is not simply the postponing of eventual rewards, but a principled refusal of premature consolation or self-compensation outside of fidelity to absent love. She challenges her disciple to be willing to give up everything, even to give up an experience of God. Quote, "From time to time, someone is so wounded by charity that he must renounce God in his enjoyment and bliss. He prefers to miss everything he might have from God if God does not preserve the sinners." Echoes of St. Paul there. One can imagine this doctrine might have upset some in her former community. And it's not simply a recognition of, let's say, the impossibility of naming God, like we might find in Meister Eckhart or Pseudo Dionysius, but it's an apophasis, a negative theology of experience of God. Quote, "Let it hurt you," she writes, "that God rejoices so much while we are so miserably far. Ah, well," she writes, "he is God." Quote, "One must let God enjoy himself in all his works," end quote, as if God were another beloved with his own wishes. In another challenging statement, Hadewijch says, quote, "God digests himself in his sweet enjoyment," end quote. While Hadewijch is left, she says, to wander alone in non-enjoyment. Worse still, Hadewijch describes a moment in which she waited patiently to enjoy God until the time was right. Once love finally offered so much that she says she sought to receive it, God withdrew this experience, and she describes it as follows, quote, "Slapped down like someone offered something in jest, and as he reaches for it, one smacks his hand, and what was offered is withdrawn," end quote. Exile also means for Hadewijch social exclusion in harsh words, scandal, shame. Quote, "Being abandoned from his own circle, being shelterless from deprivation, being completely in want," end quote. Confronted with these challenges, Hadewijch demands courage from her students. When abandoned by all, when stripped of every support and consolation, they must resist the urge to flee finitude, to flee suffering, and find the strength, she says, quote, "to remain." The power to remain in place, she says, comes from the face of Jesus crucified. Quote, "With a full heart, you should gaze upon your dear God, so that the united eyes of your desire remain fixed upon the face of your beloved by the penetrating nails that touch you with a burning that will not cease. End quote. A remarkable sentence. A bunch of metaphors move together there. But the metaphor is the burning you feel are nails that staple your eyes and fix them on Jesus on the cross. A couple of different things going on. Hadewijch calls those who exiled her, very Hadewijch personality, but she calls those who exiled her the outsiders, the exile, the aliens, Fremde in Middle Dutch or in German, the enemies, the foreigners. In her view, they're the ones who disobey divine love by rejecting her doctrine. But her exile proves her obedience, so that by occupying the periphery in her exile, she actually places herself closer to the divine center. Only those on the periphery are the ones at the center. The aliens, her opponents, those who are still comfortably in the Beguine community, depart from love by seeking to enjoy love prematurely, by refusing the task of exile. Hadewijch's obedience to love, by contrast, is contrary, quote, to the counsels of the aliens and their alien deeds. So she tries to turn the tables. She transfers this notion of Fremde, or the aliens, from unfavorable persons to unfavorable states of being. So she talks about alien joys that one should not indulge. In the important letter 6, and in some other works, Hadewijch notes that Jesus refused to call upon God's power, and kind of echoes of Philippians 2. Her insight, however, is to apply this principle consistently to the knowledge of God. So she writes, what we have to know is this: to human life belongs serving beautifully and feeling miserable. That's a good model for any undergraduates, maybe. To human life belongs serving beautifully and feeling miserable, like Jesus did when he lived as a human being. One does not find it written that Christ ever in his entire life relied at all on his Father or his mighty nature to enjoy rest. Neither did he grant himself anything except, from the beginning of his life until the end, always knew exertion. This zone of exile that she describes is the finitude of human life. But it's only by means of that same humanity that one knows love at all. Hence this paradox at the heart of Hadewijch's concept of exile. Quote, that I was a human being and felt love with a loving heart. Yet that God is so great that I, in non-enjoyment, can touch the Godhead with the humanity. So as remaining human and not appealing to a supernatural divine experience, I touch the humanity more immediately in a direct imitation of Jesus' abandonment. Bereft of God, barred from transcendence, Hadewijch says, we have only our immanent humanity, but precisely in that very human sorrow and despair, we wield that bare human nature as a means to love, and with love to touch divine love, despite this distance or despite the silence. By not departing from this exilic station, by remaining in non-fulfillment, my humanity remains with God by remaining without God, paradoxically. This perspective makes Hadewijch also a sharp analyst of the subtleties of human self-indulgence. She sounds at times like a kind of Enlightenment philosopher, like sort of mocking the religious. She says, quote, we all want indeed to be God with God, but God knows few of us want to live as a human being with God's humanity. Hadewijch's stinging words echo a modern skeptic, were it not for the fact that she's writing out of the depths of her own passionate encounter with divine love. But read this passage. We demand God, she says, in return for our good works, and we want to feel him present in this life. And it seems to us that we have merited it well, and that it would be fair that he would do in return something which we want from him. And we consider as great what we do or suffer for his sake, and we take immediately an instantaneous reward for it in the satisfaction and rest which come from him. And then we take a second reward for it in our self-satisfaction when therein we take pleasure in ourselves. In Hadewijch's account, the ordinary effort at virtue leaves the Christian tired, humiliated by opponents, isolated. And in face of these difficulties, Hadewijch suggests, the religious person narcotizes the inner pain through an apparently unconscious process of compensatory delights. This is the function of God in what Hadewijch believes to be a false misuse of the term, of course, though one popular among her Christian community that she was exiled from. God's mere presence to me is a kind of compensation. God's special favors are another, she suggests. These affective rewards are self-donated, and the God that they grant to me is an illusion of my self-regard. So we can begin to see perhaps why it was a mystery at the beginning. Why was she kicked out of her community, right? Maybe it was views like this that were not very popular. Her suspicion of the false pieties of her sisters translates into what we might even call a hermeneutics of suspicion, a skepticism, if not a denunciation of naive pieties or positive religious affective experience. Sometimes, so now Hadewijch on reason, turning to a second side. So Hadewijch on immanence, Hadewijch on reason. Sometimes we might think of medieval mysticism, particularly among women authors, as an irrational somatic experience, a passive affair of the body, and not an active enterprise of the mind. But it turns out that for Hadewijch, reason, redenen in Middle Dutch, fulfills a special office in her thoughts, even a kind of divine mission. And Hadewijch's model of rationality is certainly complex and rife with paradox. According to Hadewijch, love requires reason so that love can exceed reason, although not to suspend reason's activity. This dialectic unfolds regularly across her letters and songs. First, reason imposes a universal. It teaches God is distant, God loves all impersonally, not just Hadewijch, but everyone else as well. But then second, this authority of reason, which cannot be violated, Hadewijch says paradoxically, must be violated by the lover of God, precisely in order for love to be love. Reason must insist on its primacy, but its authority must always be overcome through the transgression of the universal, putting Hadewijch in an impossible situation. Third, if reason should insist that its universal is sufficient and enforce it without qualification, it falls into error, she says, and requires what we might call a metacritique. Through this complex account, Hadewijch does something more than just explain how the contemplative desires God. She prescribes a consistent philosophical method that flows from her insistence on immanence. According to Hadewijch, God initially contents the contemplative with great pleasure and enjoyment. She describes this autobiographically in one of her letters, letter 11. But then reason appears as an emissary from love to complicate and deepen that erotic experience. There's a beautiful and sort of charming allegorical song 25, or stanza poem 25, in which love is at first silence, but then some that she touches contents them. When love is present, gratification, capital G, in this poem, this sort of medieval allegory, would like to savor the presence of God in silence. But divine longing cries out so loudly that it wakes reason. Reason shows up and scolds the soul for its immaturity, denies any further pleasures, and says that you need to grow up and mature. And reason is then called by Hadewijch the surgeon of love, the surgeoness of love, the love, the reason that cuts and causes pain in order to heal beyond superficial pleasures. Reason is the surgeon of love. Her cuts are precisely what restore the lover back to health. Reason judges, announces, enforces the inequality, the distance between divine love and the human beloved. Not in order to frustrate or to dissuade the love of the soul in God, but to compel the soul to mature in her capacity beyond superficial delights. But since the divine beloved is without limit, there can be no end to this situation, to the stimulation of desire required. This longing needs continual enlightenment. This gratification needs indefinite, ongoing expansion, which means a perpetual deferral. As Hadewijch is defining these complementary roles of reason and love, she discovered a philosophical interlocutor that stimulated her thoughts. We can see her reading and commenting. William of Thierry, the great 12th century Benedictine, in his short treatise on the nature and dignity of love, which she quotes and comments upon in one of her letters. Love and reason, William teaches, are two eyes that together can see God. And in her letter 18, she takes up the Latin text, she translates, or has a translation, we don't know, into Middle Dutch vernacular, and then she comments upon it. If caritas, charity, is the natural side of the soul, this sight has two eyes, love and reason. Reason knows what God is not. Love rests in what God is. Reason has a more secure path. Love fails, but its failure goes even further than reason. Reason has more measure. Love has more sweetness. So she goes back and forth. And she writes, summarizing, these two help each other greatly, for reason teaches love, and love enlightens reason. And if reason yields to the desire for love, and if love lets itself be restrained and bound within the scope of reason, then they are capable of a superb work. But this leaves Hadewijch in a predicament because she says, quote, "It is such with me that I do not believe God would be loved the nearest by me." No, there's other people in the world who also love God. But neither do I believe that there is one living human being by whom God is loved so much. Yet I still have this experience of being God's unique beloved. How to reconcile those? She cannot believe that God is so uniquely near. She also cannot believe that God is so uniformly distant. The authority of reason disallows the first. The blinding pleasure of love, she says, disallows the second. Reason imposes an impersonal universal condition as a negation. God does not love any beloved more than another. It traces a boundary that Hadewijch should stay inside. But the sweet riches of love, she says, drives her across that line again and again. Love is validated when it induces Hadewijch to exceed what reason allows. Love, in short, is a violation or a suspension of the universal of reason, drawing Hadewijch into a space beyond reason, beyond the possible. The boundaries imposed by reason, paradoxically, allow Hadewijch to enter a territory of the impossible. This means there are two dangers for good lovers to avoid. The first, an overly simple love without conflict, the error of the aliens. The second, an overly simple reason that considers its universality to be final and self-sufficient, as if one could think the love of God within the limits of reason alone, which she says would be a mistake. So she gives lots of examples of when does reason stray? When does reason make an error? When it pursues abstract moral rules, she says. When a rule becomes a temptation. Or in a misplaced fear or dread of God, in which reason becomes too docile. She writes, reason well knows that one has to fear God, and that God is great, and the human being small. If reason then fears the greatness of God because of the human smallness, and omits to seize upon the greatness of God, and begins to suspect that she is not becoming God's dearest child, and thinks that such a great being does not belong to her, so much transcendence, then reason strays, and in a great many things more. When reason makes God too far, or when an apophatic theology emphasizes too much transcendence, that's a rational mistake. Okay. To conclude, back to our imaginary portrait here. Hadewijch suffered the event of exile and then theorized it as a concept of exile, an exile into immanence that renounces transcendence out of fidelity to her beloved. By reconstructing her theory, we can retrieve her philosophical contribution today and in some small way give sense to that painful exclusion that first fired her thought. But after her real exile, and after her own idealization in understanding it, another exile remains, namely the exile of Hadewijch and perhaps other mystical women as well from the historiography of medieval philosophy. Hadewijch's concept of reason, however, might sound familiar to modern philosophical ears, if you possess modern philosophical ears. For her, reason is not a faculty of intuition, a skill of distinction, an experience of illumination, but first and foremost, a critical limit imposed negatively against the enthusiasms of immediate experience. When one yearns to know everything of God, one's reason polices this desire and appeals to the authority of an ethical universal, namely, that God is too supreme to make private revelations or favor particular individuals with greater or lesser love. The enforcement of reason's universal is then experienced as something painful, a burden that must be sustained stubbornly out of duty. Rather than seek to escape the rigors of reason in a superficial quest for happiness, one ought to recall that one's humanity has been dignified by this duty to remain inside the bounds of the ethical universal. So long as Hadewijch abides by these difficult teachings of reason, she wins autonomy from her traditionalist partisans, from the aliens who seek to constrain her will by force. To our surprise, if you didn't catch the hints, Hadewijch's depiction of reason echoes that of Immanuel Kant fairly distinctly, at least in a general outline, to our surprise, circa 1250. But this is only the first moment of Hadewijch's own concept of reason. For she teaches, that's not the end of it, that the same universal of critical reason must be paradoxically both obeyed and transgressed. And its overcoming leaves it, however, suspended in place. But left to itself, reason could swell from this role into a totalizing authority, denatured from its function within a larger economy of desire. Its straying misconstrues the link between reason and power and avoids the challenge of surpassing reason. For Hadewijch, the ultimate task of thinking is not staying within the boundaries of reason alone, but exiling oneself beyond that limit into some more uncertain topography. This figure of entering the impossible in violation of the Kantian universal is not far from attempts to overcome the universal by a Kierkegaard or even a Nietzsche, whether, as in the first case, as a leap into the zone of absurdity that preserves the universal as a temptation, Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling, or as a pathology of the universal, which the strong should reject to rediscover true joy, Nietzsche, at his best. Listen for a moment to Kierkegaard's portrait of the Knight of Faith in Fear and Trembling. Quote, the Knight of Faith. He empties the deep sadness of existence in infinite resignation. He knows the blessedness of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything, the dearest things he has, and yet the finite tastes every bit as good to him as someone who never knew anything higher. For his remaining infinitude has no trace of a dispirited, anxious training, yet he has this confidence to delight in it, as if it were the most certain thing of all. End quote. Their fascinating essay, What is Philosophy? Deleuze and Guattari argue that the history of philosophy is not simply a matter of sequential events. They urge historians of philosophy to, quote, give up a narrowly historical point of view of before and after. What we ought to use, they say, is not historical sequence, but the kind of stratigraphic time that layers different philosophical voices. whether or not you buy the whole package on that. But there's an interesting quote that I want to close with. Philosophical time, they say, is thus a grandiose time of coexistence that does not exclude the before and after, but superimposes them in a stratigraphic order. It is an infinite becoming of philosophy that cross-cuts its history without being confused with it. The life of the philosophers, what's most external to their work, conforms to the ordinary laws of succession, but their proper names coexist and shine as luminous points that take us through the components of a concept, or the cardinal points of a stratum or layer that come back to us, like dead stars whose light is brighter than ever. Philosophy is becoming, not history, the coexistence of planes, not the succession of systems. The history of philosophy attends to context and textual transmissions, but what makes it the history of philosophy is its freedom and its right to exit diachronic sequences and grasp concepts. Juxtaposing concepts on the strength of their thought is a feature of philosophical interpretation. Do we have the right to read Hadewijch as a philosopher? I think we should insist on the freedom to think with her today, as Heidegger thinks with Heraclitus, or as Aquinas thinks with Pseudo-Dionysius. To call Hadewijch as a philosopher, and not only a mystic, is neither to denigrate her mysticism, nor to award her a dubiously gendered crown. It is to assert the prerogative to read her in more than one way, in recognition of the fecundity of her concepts, dead stars whose light is brighter than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. What a tour de force. I'm still absorbing it all. Since we invited the students from Dr. Ha's class, Free to Think, to attend, I think they should be free to think, and I would take the first question from an undergraduate, if there is one.
You mentioned fidelity is unfaith and a renunciation of escaping the conditions of living. Curious to think how you think that reckons with these new ideas of escaping the conditions of humanity through technology.
Question. I mean, we can only speculate, but I think, judging from her works, Hadewijch would find that as a kind of, in her words, not to offend, but sometimes she offends, like a kind of pseudo-religious quest to escape the identity of being human in the body. I think that's what she would say about that. Sorry to the transhumanists. Yeah.
I'm curious what it is. I'm curious what it is about the community that made her feel like she was closer to God when she was in it, especially when you mentioned that she kind of had a suspicion of false piety about the other sisters.
Yeah, it's the best we can do to reconstruct. So everything we have about her are in these corpus of writings in these 4 genres. And so everything that I said about her experience, we're trying to infer the best we can out of a handful. So I have about 41 letters. I think it's like 5 to 7 of them are autobiographical, and the rest are topical about something she wants to teach about. When she writes back to the women who remain in the community, she names a few of them. She's very authoritative with them. She'll be like, is Marguerite still being lazy and things like that. She writes back, what about Sarah? Oh, I guess she doesn't have time for me anymore. I haven't heard from her. So there seems to have been, in the sorority with other women, that was part of the ease of it, at least. The enemies she has, I keep thinking that they were sort of, men for some reason. But of course they're not. There are other women in the community who, for some reason, didn't appreciate her teachings. But that's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. Why did she associate being close with God in that community if she was already, we think, it might be that our timeline is wrong, but sort of kicking against the grain of living in that community? That's a good question. It seems to be that when she's writing back, and I guess this is my best answer, she's writing back to a small cell in a larger community. Warning them not to compromise with those aliens. She's asking after only a small group. So it might have been like a circle of students that she was close to, a small coterie of students, and that's who she misses, but she doesn't miss the sort of general population in her begging.
back, one of whoever's first.
I was just curious that Hadewijch describes reason as like the surgeon that cuts to purify love.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious on how medieval audiences understand this connection between like suffering and spiritual growth, like more broadly.
Yes. Well, for medieval Christians, I mean, although we have to say not until the 11th and 12th century. So at least in Western Christianity, identification with Jesus suffering on the cross as a weak and frail human with vulnerabilities that we have in our bodies, that's only kind of an 11th, 12th century innovation in Christian religious, right? So imitation of the suffering of Jesus as a way to grow closer to God is from that point on and is widely shared, and we see that through medieval art when we start to see crucifixes with the body on there, displaying the suffering as something to be embraced. Hadewijch uses the word physica and is translated as surgeon, or I think nicely by Columba Hart as surgeoness, because that's what we're talking about. But surgeon, physica also means doctor or scientist or natural philosopher. It's someone with know-how who you trust their authority, even though you don't share their knowledge, even if they're doing something that on the surface seems to be pressing, or whatever medieval medical practice, at that point. But I think that's part of the conceptualization. But that part, I think, is widely shared. What's distinct about Hadewijch is not that she says Jesus suffered in his body, so that when I suffer in my body, I can relate to God even more. That was widely held in the 12th century. But Hadewijch in 1250 is saying Jesus was abandoned and didn't hear from God on the cross. So the more that I hear divine silence, or an emptiness of experience, or I feel that God doesn't exist, that's not an exit from Christian faith. That's an opportunity for a profound, paradoxically, deepening in Christian faith. And she calls that a fidelity that goes beyond faith, to be an
Next door.
Yeah, I'm curious to know your thoughts on gender in this kind of in the story of her life and her writings, and how do you think her being a woman may have changed how her writings and her thoughts were received? And if it was a male that was in this exact same position of isolation, would that have had a larger impact, at the time, or would that be kind of perceived differently?
Yeah, I mean, probably to be sure, a male author would have been read more and copied more. That's just the way things work. But Hadewijch was immediately read, immediately within the next century, by Jan van Ruysbroek, who's like an important Augustinian theologian, licensed, Lydian community in Groenendaal, and a strong connection between medieval Beguine mysticism and the brothers and sisters of the common life and the Devotio Moderna. So there's like a really important transition. Now, he translates her back into Latin. There's a little bit of domestication. He sands down the rough edges, It's a little less spicy, I think, in John of Ruysbroek and that sort of translation movement. But that's the biggest moment of Hadewijch reception. In terms of her gender identity, it was for all of these great, Hall of Fame women mystics that we might think about. Joan of Norwich or Hildegard of Bingen. She's an exceptional case because she had a lot of money and power. But Marguerite Porete, Mechtilde Magdeburg, etc., the list goes on. When Marguerite was arrested and she was put to the stake by the church, was burned at the stake for her book. Her book was called The Mirror of Simple Souls. And she was given a chance to recant. She said, "This is the book I wrote. I'm not recanting." And she was burned for it. And in the process against her, they didn't just call her the woman who wrote the book. They called her quaedam mulier, which means a certain woman. But the resonance really means a so-called woman who wrote the book, right? As if her gender identity was not only to blame for the errors, but was somehow called into question by her having such a teaching authority. Hadewijch didn't undergo that, but we have lots of instances of people saying one thing and getting in trouble for it, and then maybe a Dominican or a cardinal in later centuries will say the same thing, and surprisingly, no problems. That's relatively common, unfortunately.
We can take one more question. Taylor?
David, thanks so much for this. I really, really enjoyed that. I have a good sense from your talk about what reading Hadewijch under the rubric of philosophy does for our understanding of Hadewijch. I'm wondering what accepting her into the canon of philosophy does for our understanding of philosophy on the other side. And I'm particularly interested, you mentioned this rhyming of Hadewijch on reason with Kant. Hadewijch, as you mentioned, has a Christological warrant for doing this, which is not often how we read Kant. I mean, Kant was awoken from his dogmatic slumber by Hume, not Jesus, as it were. So my question is, does Hadewijch's arrival at this position, does it offer an alternative version of critical philosophy, or does it allow our rereading of Kant on critical philosophy from a Christian perspective? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great question. I'm still thinking about this. I mean, I'm sort of working with the Hadewijch case because it's the one that I find the most appealing and fun to teach. So I've been doing that. But I think the accent would be more on not Kant. I mean, Kant's importance that we understand what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are doing to turn away from Kant. So if there's a new kind of resonance in post-Kantian philosophy of religion with questions about religion and faith and impossibility, which are topics certainly in Kierkegaard and to some extent in Nietzsche as well. And if there's even a kind of attempt to read Nietzsche through the eyes, or through the lens of mystical traditions, which is what Georges Bataille represents, a mystical rereading of Nietzsche as a mystic of a kind, then that's an interesting fold there between sort of late 19th, 20th century philosophy of religion and the topics it finds important, and the mystical tradition. And I think we've sort of experienced this. There's a lot of interesting, from the 50s and 60s and 70s, sort of post-structuralist interest in the mystical tradition. Why? Why would Derrida be reading Dionysius? Why is Bataille obsessed with Angelo Foligno? This begins to give some kind of an account for the nexus there, even if it cuts against our centuries.
Before we conclude, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Really appreciate you being here. If you want to learn more about Fons Vitae, you can go to our website and get a newsletter. We have a QR code in the back of our flyer. But let's end by thanking Dr. Albertson. It was very provocative.